They tried to bring their kids to my wedding after I said no. My cousin and aunt then conspired to sabotage our day, but we fought back. I never thought a wedding invitation could feel like a line in the sand, but the moment I read my cousin's message, I realized everything had become battleground. They wanted to bring children to my wedding. My cousin Valeria, with her 2 small, lively kids, and her mother, my Aunt Maria, acted like the stakes were life or death. I was Sophie, and I had to decide whether to let them cross that line. The decision unfolded like a slow ache in my ribs, one that made my breath short and my hands cold, because I could see both sides of it and neither side was entirely innocent. The florist's brochure lay on the kitchen table like proof of intent, while conversation around it felt like a different language. The scent of lilies from the sample bouquet would, I imagined, be overwhelmed by the tang of juice boxes and crayons. David and I had been meticulous. Our choices were deliberate, our guest list curated to create a particular atmosphere, and we both agreed children did not belong in that picture. Not for cruelty, not because we disliked children. We simply wanted an evening designed for grown-up generosity, one where conversations could linger and the small silences between vows could actually exist. That was our definition of intimacy for that night. Family history lived in every crevice of the house. The afternoons of my childhood were full of running laughter and sticky fingers. Those memories warmed me and complicated me. When my mother said, half pleading and half negotiating, "Sophie, it's just Valeria and the kids, can't we make an exception?" I understood she wasn't only defending them. She was defending what she imagined family should mean: flexibility, forgiveness, softness. But there are moments in life where softness becomes a cost you can no longer afford, and I couldn't decide if asking for a child-free wedding was selfish or necessary. Aunt Maria, though, brought a different energy. When she said, "If you don't let them come, I won't come," the words landed like a cliff. There was no negotiation in her tone, only a subtle threat folded inside a familial ultimatum. She painted my refusal as a moral shortcoming, as if my choice revealed some deficiency deep in my wiring, unwillingness to sacrifice personal preference for kinship. I listened and felt the familiar tug of belonging. I remembered the way the family had always rallied around one another, the small things we did that never made the papers but kept us feeling tethered. Saying no felt like breaking a string in an elaborate mobile. Valeria came to me a week later, soft around the eyes, her 2 children at her side like satellite moons orbiting her mood. She smiled and asked as though I might be the keeper of a great injustice. "Sophie," she said, voice small and earnest, "they don't leave me alone about things like weddings. The kids ask about your dress. They ask what the cake will taste like. This would mean the world to them." Her plea cut through me because once, when we were children, she'd shared her candy with me under a porch light and we'd made a pact about secrets. I honored that memory and also imagined the scene. Tiny shoes tapping near the front row, a child mistaking the aisle for a runway. My mouth felt dry. "It's not personal," I wanted to say, but personal was the only thing it had become. Then I overheard a conversation in the kitchen that changed the geometry of my discomfort into something sharper. I went for a glass of water and paused, because the voices were there behind the door. Valeria's breath hitching, my aunt's low chuckle, the mutter of agreement like an undertow. Their plan wasn't clumsy. It was mischievous and deliberate. They spoke of ways to prove a point about the wedding, of small disruptions that would force my hand. They laughed about scenarios, a shriek at the vows, a staged spill, a burst of deliberate chaos, that would paint me as unkind if I stood firm. The realization knifed through me. Betrayal is a particular, hot kind of grief. It rearranged my heartbeat. I couldn't sit with that discovery and do nothing. There are rules in families and there are wounds. Sometimes the two overlap. I confided in David, whose steadiness became an anchor I hadn't known I needed. He listened without interruption, jaw set beneath a calm exterior. "We'll handle this together," he said simply, and those words wrapped around me like armor. They didn't fix everything, but they made the thing feel possible. We told my mother, whose immediate softness shifted into something more like resolve when she realized the nature of the plan. She was both my advocate and my strategist, and for the first time in a long while I watched her change from mediator into partner. Not everyone knew. We kept the information limited, because gossip spreads like wild grass. One evening, a cousin who had been close to Valeria pulled me aside under a street lamp, his face shadowed and nervous. He had been roped into their plotting, and now felt the weight of it against his teeth. "They want to embarrass you," he said, in that flat, practical voice that had always made him seem older than his years. "Not because of anything you did, but to make you choose between family and your rules." There was shame in him, the way someone feels awkward about choosing to do the right thing when the right thing costs them something. I was grateful and sad in the same breath. We began to plan, not with breathless vindictiveness but with the clinical calm of people who had rehearsed 1,000 small nightmares. We rechecked our guest list, clarified the no children policy in writing, and gave the wedding planner clear instructions on how to handle entrances and attempts at disruption. David took a list of potential troublemakers and created seating that minimized opportunities for confrontation. My mother, whose instincts favored mercy, said, "We won't humiliate anyone, we'll just protect the evening." That felt like a truce within the war. There was a small private rehearsal in our kitchen where we spoke in codes and contingencies. "If someone tries to force their way in, the ushers will politely show them the policy," David said, the kind of sentence that sounded like a script for a well-behaved military exercise. My mother practiced gentle but firm lines to diffuse confrontation. She always had the rare talent of making rebukes sound like offers. I practiced saying, "I'm sorry, we have a firm policy," in a tone that wasn't an apology but not an accusation either. We rehearsed the way to keep our faces soft even when our decisions were immovable. At nights, the house felt like the eye of a storm. There was a hum of normal life, the dishwasher, the late-night infomercial voice, the creak of the porch step, but underneath it, my mind ran through scenarios. I imagined a child yanking a ring from the groom, a tantrum rising to drown out emotion. I thought of the many weddings I'd attended that had stumbled under chaos not because of malice but simply because children are unpredictable in small ways that escalate in public spaces. That was selfish, I thought at times, desiring a pristine, curated moment in a world that didn't owe me perfection. But I also knew that our wedding was a rare, finite thing, and our right to protect its shape mattered. Valeria and my aunt were not stupid. They had allies, as families do. They coaxed, they appealed to memory, they pointed at pictures of shared birthdays and slid nostalgia like currency across the table. My aunt summoned people as grandmothers summon grandchildren. Only this summons came with a condition. She would not come, she said in a voice that tried to sound dignified, and her absence would come with a moral statement. People will know, she warned. And perhaps they would. Family reputations shift like sand, and sometimes one decision looks monstrous from one angle and principled from another. When the plot began to feel less like rumor and more like choreography, we tightened the frame. We told the catering to make sure cocktails were served in ways that discouraged boisterous running, we asked the band to keep certain songs for later when the room would be more relaxed, and we arranged for certain friends, those steady, practical people who speak gently but cut quick, to be near the front row. We were not planning to ambush our relatives. We were planning to preserve our night. The tension swelled in the weeks before the wedding. Invitations had been sent. RSVPs tracked the usual patchwork of likely absences and surprising appearances. There were hurt texts, gentle nudges, and the occasional cold silence that rang like a bell. My mother and I argued more than we normally did. There was a particular night of shouting where the air between us crackled, and each time I thought we'd reached a place of sabotage, she would circle back with a soft apology, acknowledging the grief of both sides. "No one wants this to hurt," she said once, and both of us began to cry, not from defeat but from the difficulty of choosing what to protect. I had nights where I wanted to fold, to invite them, to let the water out of the tense balloon of conflict, and let it drift placidly away. Those nights were cowardly in a certain sweetness, to choose ease over principle. I pictured the wedding and the small, private things that mattered to me and David. The way he would smile when I mispronounced a line from a poem, the hush in the room when the officiant asked the big question. Those were not theatrical vanities. They were the quiet reasons we had chosen each other. They deserved a night that honored them. Then came the day I overheard a more detailed plan. I had gone to the kitchen for a tea and paused because voices were low and urgent. They spoke of orchestrated interruptions, a staged fainting, a child brought forward as an innocent distraction, a cousin prepared to perform a loud, embarrassing story about the groom to get me to relent. They chuckled about sermons they would deliver like weapons, about how to leverage presence into moral leverage. My stomach knotted. I felt small and enraged simultaneously, A combustible mix that made me want to call everyone and tell the truth in a flood. But truth has a weight. It can wound and it can heal. I chose a different path. A cousin, someone close to them, turned ally. He came to me with confession and embarrassment. I shouldn't be telling you this, he admitted, eyes darting to the pastry counter as if the croissants would tattle. He had been part of the plan but was already uncomfortable with the notion of humiliation as performance art. He offered details that made my spine stiff and my thoughts sharpen. They're not thinking about the kids as much as they are thinking about winning, he said. There was sorrow in him for the prospective spectacle. His betrayal of them felt like fidelity to decency to me. With the information came a different kind of courage. David, my mother, and I sat at the table. 3 people with different temperaments but a single aim: protect the sanctity of the afternoon. We drew up contingencies like surgeons preparing for a complex operation. The wedding planner was briefed in clear, unemotional terms. The ushers were given scripts. We arranged for the parking attendant to be instructed politely to ask for invitations. There was a quietness to our planning, a refusal to let drama beget drama. The week before the wedding smelled like cut flowers and printer ink. The dress arrived and hung like a promise on a hook in my room. I would stand in front of it and imagine who I was in the wedding. Not a villain or a martyr, but someone constructing a memory we could live with. There was fear, yes, the particular fear of estrangement that comes when you set a boundary and family members choose to test it. But there was also a new realization of agency. I had agency. We had agency. Ownership of that fact changed the way small and large choices tasted. On the morning of the wedding, the house moved in quiet, purposeful motions. Buttons were sewn, last-minute calls made, a braid smoothed down like the final press of a hand. I could feel the world getting ready. The dress took me into its shape like a slow, intimate ritual. David called from the venue with a gentle calm. "Everything is set," he said, voice low with its own sort of excitement. There was a steadiness in him that I drank. When I walked to the car, my heart pounded with a steady rhythm, the kind of rhythm you'd have before jumping into water. Sharp, expectant, irrevocable. We had taken measures that kept the entrance controlled. The policy was printed on a small tasteful card and tucked into the invitation. The gist clear: a child-free ceremony to preserve the adult tone of the event. It was not mean. It was a choice stated plainly. For some, the choice sounded cold. For us, it was clarity. On the drive, I listened to the world slide past in green, the trees like soft witnesses, my hands smellingly of lavender and the faint metal tang of nerves. At the venue, the florist's lilies smelled sweet and steady, accompanied by rosemary that made the air taste fresh and expectant. Musicians tuned and laughed. A violinist plucked a melody that made my throat catch. I felt everything: the heat of the lights, the small prickle at the base of my neck, the steadiness of David's hand when he reached for mine. Then I noticed 2 empty chairs near the front, distinctly vacant, deliberately so. One where Valeria might have sat, one where my aunt might have settled, oblique evidence of a choice concretized. People noticed the absences. Whispers threaded through the crowd like small birds. I could hear my name used in sentences that held various agendas. Some were curious, some sympathetic, some sharp with judgment. The absence of my aunt and cousin was a kind of punctuation the family would discuss for years. There was an immediate rush of small victories. The officiant's voice found room in the quiet for the vows, and the words had space to settle and to be breathed in fully. The ceremony had an intimacy that wasn't stolen by crisis. It hummed with gratitude and the odd peace of a contained room. After the ceremony, snippets reached me like echoes. My aunt had indeed made a dramatic spectacle at home, storming and declaring that she wouldn't attend. Valeria had prepared a speech, we later learned, a fierce, constructed piece of rhetorical pressure meant to shame me into compliance, but cooler heads, and perhaps the realization that a spectacle would make them look small, prevented the delivery. The relief I felt at that unsaid choice surprised me. Victory tastes odd when it's not the kind you wish for. The reception felt luminous. The light pooled like a benediction, falling softly on faces as the band played and the plates clinked. My mother leaned in at one point, the music subdued, and said, "You were right to hold your ground." That sentence was a stone dropped into still water, sending out concentric calm. I didn't want to relish the humiliation anyone might have felt in private, but there was a necessary sharpness to the night that honored our intention. Evening conversations settled into the small warmth of people who loved us. Friends who had never been close offered congratulations and stayed late. Some family members never got over it. Others recalibrated. There were awkward dinners after where certain chairs remained empty, and quiet holidays where ghosts of that night brushed at the table. But there were also new constellations. People who had felt distant came nearer, attracted by the gravity of our decision. It was a strange reweaving of the familial fabric. Some seams tightened, others severed. Months later there were reunions that felt like patchwork. In some rooms, we navigated unspoken resentments with a brittle politeness. In others, we found laughter again, tentative as spring shoots. Time wore at tensions in its own slow way. There were conversations about boundaries that I had never expected to have, honest and difficult, where adults had to articulate what respect meant in practical terms. I learned that saying no is not always cruelty. Sometimes it's honesty disguised as a boundary. I won't pretend I felt triumphant in the way villains do. I did not enjoy the humiliation that some relatives experienced. That would have been a small, selfish pleasure that would have left stains. What I felt was a complicated mix of relief and sorrow. Relief that our night remained ours. Sorrow that people I loved felt wounded by our choice. 4 days after the wedding I held both feelings like jagged stones, aware of the sharpness and the practicality of their weight. Over time, the edges softened. The aunt called once, halting at the other end of the line, her voice trying on apologies like unfamiliar clothes. Valeria texted in fits and starts. First anger, then silence, then a simple "I miss you" that landed in my message thread at midnight. The family realigned itself in ways that made sense only later. Some ties loosened, others rewove with different patterns. I saw that life didn't end because of a night. It rearranged. I am not proud of the humiliation that anyone endured, and I don't revel in the way anger can twist people. What I am sure of is that we protected the kind of memory we wanted. The wedding became a clearing, a place where we lit a candle and allowed it to burn steady. That steady flame was not meant to scorch. It was meant to illuminate a particular start for two people trying to build a life together. The lesson I kept learning, awkward and blunt, is that boundaries are not always tender. They can be the firm railroad ties that keep a train from careening off into chaos. Saying no sometimes breaks things. Saying no sometimes preserves the things that matter most. There were nights I replayed every exchange, trying to imagine how else things could have gone. Was there a kinder path? Possibly. Would it have protected us from the sting of absence? Maybe. But there is a clarity to making a conscious, hard choice and standing by it. That clarity served as a foundation on which we built other honest conversations. About work, about money, about what we wanted a family to look like when and if it arrived. Those later conversations, tough as they were made possible by a certain insistence that we could be architects of our life. At family gatherings now, the tapestry shows seams in places. There are chairs that remain empty on certain holidays, and there are sentences that are never said out loud. But I've also found new friendships stitched into the gaps. People who told me quietly, after a meal, that they admired the way we held our ground. Those small allies are as real as any blood tie. They sat with us in our living room in the months after the wedding and told stories that patched the bruise in slow, kind ways. I think of my children, if there are children in my future, and wonder how they will hear the story. Will they think their mother was petty or brave? The lines between those adjectives blur depending on the angle, and perhaps that is the point. We are messy. We are contradictory. We love and hurt and forgive in cycles that rarely make sense. Still, I like to imagine telling them that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a relationship is to set the terms of engagement honestly, even if it means people you love will show you their worst. It is messy and human and, in the end, ours. Sometimes the family that remains is different from the family you grew up in. It is no worse. It is simply the one you actively choose to inhabit. The holidays now are less predictable, sometimes full, sometimes painfully sparse. But they are honest. Perhaps that is the moral, awkward as it may sound. You cannot protect everything and please everyone at once. You pick a few things you value most, and you guard them with whatever courage you can muster. That guarding will wound people sometimes, and perhaps that is the price of keeping the heart of something sacred. When I look back, I see not a victory parade but a clearing that allowed two people to start a life without an avoidable chaos on their first night. It felt decisive and small, a human-sized decision with consequences that reached farther than we'd imagined. But those consequences taught me about clarity, and about the cost of kindness when kindness is not the same as surrender. I am still family with those who left and those who stayed, though the lines are drawn differently now. The love is still there, knotted and imperfect, but it has boundaries that hold it together rather than letting it fray. In the months since, I have been surprised by the tenderness that can grow out of hard choices. Some relatives reached back slowly, with cautious questions and an attempt at repair. Others never did, and I learned to accept that some people will choose their pride over connection. That acceptance was not easy. It demanded that I learn to hold multiple truths at once. That I had hurt people, and that I had also protected something valuable. Those two truths sat together like mismatched chairs in my living room, uncomfortable but real. I keep that night as a reference point, a strange landmark in the map of my life. It's not a place I go back to often, but when I do I find lessons. About clarity, about the cost of saying no, about the stubbornness that sometimes feels like survival. The wedding itself remains a soft, bright memory. The way the light hit the guests, the hush when the vows were spoken, the relief that came afterward when we danced with a room that was, for a few hours, entirely ours. There are mornings now when I wake up and think of reconciliation. Small acts that might make the road smoother. A text, a check-in, a pie delivered at the right moment. Those are not grand gestures, but they are gestures. They are the quiet work of stitching. I will do some of them, and others I won't, and the family will be what it will be. I have learned to live with the unfinished business of love. And if someone asks me directly whether I was right, I often say two things. First, that I acted out of love for the life I wanted to share with David. Second, that I would be open to repair where it was genuine. Love requires boundaries, but it also requires the willingness to mend when the mending is sincere. Not every absence was punitive. Some were protective. Not every presence would have been healing. Those are the paradoxes of being human. Sometimes, when the house is quiet and the dishes are done and I can hear the street outside breathing, I think about the small child who once shared her candy with me under a porch light. I think about how people change, and how family is a series of negotiations between the person you were and the person you want to be. That memory of sharing candy is not erased by what happened. It remains, stubborn and sweet. The two moments coexist, and that coexistence is, oddly, another kind of grace. At the end of it all, I realized I had been asking the wrong question for a long time. I had asked whether I was being selfish. The better question was whether I was being honest. Boundaries are not the opposite of love. Sometimes they are its language. They tell people what we can and cannot carry for them. They delineate the shape of what we can offer. Saying no to certain things made room for yes to others. The yes of a ceremony heard without interruption, the yes of a life begun with intention. I am not naive enough to think this solved everything. There are still family dinners with awkward pockets and unsaid things. There are holidays threaded with an odd quiet. But there is also a sense of having acted ethically in a way that protected a fragile, meaningful night. That matters. Not because the night was perfect, that is not the point, but because it was ours, deliberate and chosen. That kind of choice has a weight that, while heavy, is also honest. If the story ends with something like tawdry triumph, it would be a lie. The story, for me, ends with a small, persistent lesson. That love sometimes asks you to set terms, and setting terms can look like selfishness to someone watching from a different angle. You have to live with that perception. You have to accept that people you love may show you their worst when you assert your boundaries. But sometimes the truest kindness is to be transparent about who you are and what you will allow into your life. People will tell this story differently. Some will say I was cruel. Others will say I was brave. The truth sits somewhere between. The most important thing is not the verdict of others but the texture of the life we built afterward. Dinners with guests who were delighted to be present, quiet Sunday mornings, plans made without apology. Those are the things that mattered in the long run. Months later, when family gatherings became intermittent, and the dust settled, I found a new kind of peace. Not peace that erased the past, but peace that recognized the contours of it. We had drawn a line, and the world had adjusted. Some people crossed back over it, tentatively, their humor returned in small measures. Others did not. I let go of the ones who chose not to cross. That letting go was neither savage nor saintly. It was simply practical. It made room for the people who wanted to be part of our lives as we were. Now, on a quiet afternoon, I sometimes rehearse the conversation I would like to have with Valeria in the future. A conversation rooted in honesty, not theatrics. I would tell her I understood what it felt like to be excluded, and I would ask her to understand the very real reasons David and I had for wanting a particular type of night. Maybe she would listen. Maybe she would not. Either way, the attempt would be genuine, and that is the best any of us can promise. Looking back, it is strange how much of life can hinge on a single choice. A seating chart, a printed policy, a refusal. They sound trivial until you recognize how loud their consequences can be. I am learning to own my decisions without needing universal approval. The wedding taught me that boundaries can be an act of self-care, not a weapon. Self-care is not always pretty, and it is not always popular, but sometimes it is essential. In the end, I do not want to be a person who keeps score of who left and who stayed. I want to be someone who remembers why certain decisions were made and who still finds ways to love, imperfect and human as always. My family will continue to be a complicated, messy constellation. We will navigate it as we can, sometimes stumbling, sometimes walking hand in hand. What I gained out of this conflict was not a victory over people I loved, but a clearer understanding of the life I wanted and the courage to defend its fragile edges. And so the story sits in my memory as a lesson wrapped in discomfort. The kind of lesson that smells faintly of lilies and rosemary, that hums with music and the rustle of a dress, that leaves a small, stubborn light burning where a candle once stood. It is not the ending I would have written for anyone else, but it is the ending that allowed the beginning of the life David and I are building to start with intention. Sometimes the kinds of choices that hurt in the short term create the space for deeper joy later. I will live with that complexity, and I will try, always, to meet family with openness, even if it means sometimes setting a boundary that looks harsh from afar. When I reflect on that time, what stays with me is not the gossip or the absence, but the sound of the string quartet tuning. An oddly human sound, half chaos and half order, right before a moment of music begins. That sound reminds me that tension can resolve into harmony if you hold to what matters. The cost was real and the consequence lasting, but the choice felt true. For that reason, I would do it again, because the life we wanted needed that one precise, guarded beginning. If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, share, and comment. Thanks for your attention.